Okay, if I could have your attention, please continue eating, but we're going to get this program going because there's several moving parts going simultaneously, and we don't want to run them all together and cascade across the afternoon. Here during lunch, we have two basic elements. One element is an award that will be given by Admiral Bull, who is Sinatra. Sinatra is the Chief of Naval Aviation Training. Now, for those of you who have been in aviation, naval aviation, you know exactly what that is. For some of those who have not been very close to it, basically, you're never a naval aviator till he says you're a naval aviator, okay? And every one of us who wears wings has a certificate that is signed by Sinatra. Current Sinatra is Admiral Bull, Snapper Bull, and he has an award for the training squadrons.
Our first award this afternoon will be the Training Excellence Award for the Advanced Squadron. Helicopter Training Squadron 18, Vigilant Eagles, is the recipient of the 2015 Sinatra Training Excellence Award, Advanced Squadron. Helicopter Training Squadron 18 was selected for this distinguished award based on their outstanding achievements in the flight training of advanced student pilots within the Naval Air Training Command. In 2015, the Vigilant Eagles of HT-18 established an outstanding benchmark of performance and professionalism with safe, quality, and efficient flight training. Their instructors met all challenges, routinely flying 3 sorties each day that resulted in 183 winged naval aviators to the fleet. The squadron flew an impressive 25,493 flight hours with over 13,000 sorties. Among the advanced squadrons, Helicopter Training Squadron 18 demonstrated the best training efficiency and the most innovative approaches to training excellence throughout 2015. The commanding officer of HT-18, Commander Brian Sanderson, is receiving this award from the Chief of Naval Air Training, Rear Admiral Del Bull, on behalf of his squadron today. Training Excellence Award, Primary Squadron. Training Squadron 3, Red Knights, is the recipient of the 2015 Training Squadron Excellence Award, Primary Squadron. Training Squadron 3 was selected for a distinguished award based upon their outstanding achievement in the flight training of primary students within the Naval Aviation Training Command. In 2015, the Red Knights of VT3 have established an outstanding benchmark for performance and professionalism with safe, quality, and efficient flight training. The motivated cadre of instructors executed 19,885 flight hours and graduated 269 student naval aviators with an impressive time to train of less than 30 weeks. Among the primary squadrons, Training Squadron 3 demonstrated the best training efficiency and the most innovative approaches to training excellence throughout 2015. Commanding Officer of VT3, Commander Jade Lepke, is accepting the award from the Chief of Naval Air Training, Rear Admiral Bull, on behalf of his entire squadron today. Training Squadron 3 is also the recipient of the 2015 Goldthwait Award. The Goldthwait Award for Training Excellence is sponsored by the Boeing Company and named after Vice Admiral Robert Goldthwait. We'd like to take a moment to recognize Ms. Debbie Rube, Vice President of Boeing's Global Strike Business Unit and a member of the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation Board of Directors. Vice Admiral Goldthwait significantly contributed as a flight instructor and later as Chief of Naval Air Training. This award is the premier unit award within the Naval Aviation Training community. Training Squadron 3 was selected for this distinguished award based upon their outstanding achievements in the training of student pilots within the Naval Air Training Command in 2015. Training Squadron 3, Red Knights, demonstrated the best training efficiency and the most innovative approaches to training excellence. Receiving this award is Commander Jade Lepke, the commanding officer of VT3 from Rear Admiral Bull, Naval Air Training Command.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vice Admiral John CURRIER, U.S. Coast Guard retired. I'm here to introduce my good friend who will give us a luncheon remarks. Captain Bob Workman is a 1959 graduate of the Coast Guard Academy. He's a fixed and rotary wing aviator, flew at 6 Coast Guard air stations for nearly 7,000 flight hours. He's also done several other unique staff things, including liaison with 3-letter agencies that we can't talk about. but early on in the President Bush war on drugs, Bob was a uniquely capable and well-placed individual to transition into what is now GIATF South and some of the other infrastructure that we have. So without further ado, I'll introduce my good friend, Captain Bob Workman.
Thank you, John. I'd like to talk about Elmer Stone. Elmer Stone, you ask any Coast Guard aviator who he was, and you'll probably hear that, well, yeah, he was our first pilot in the Coast Guard. And he did a lot of amazing things. But, you know, he was much more than just our first aviator. During his career, he was a visionary that accomplished a great deal. He served his country, the Coast Guard, the Navy, selflessly over 25 years. He was Naval Aviator number 38 and Coast Guard Aviator number 1. He was the pilot of flying boat NC-4 for the first transatlantic flight, whose Navy crew successfully crossed the Atlantic. He had a profound effect on the successful development of naval aviation itself. During his first 10 years of service, after graduating from the naval flight training, he was assigned to the U.S. Navy at the Navy's request. To really understand his accomplishments and his contributions to naval aviation, you need to have a little background. Prior to 1915, the entire federal government was funded by customs and tariff duties, mostly from maritime commerce. There was no federal income tax. In August 4th, 1790 rather, that reversed, the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, established the Revenue Cutter Service. And it was to collect customs and tariffs duties from foreign shipping and to act as the new federal government's sole naval armed force. He wanted the foreign maritime commerce to pay for the federal government, not the citizens. Cutters patrolled offshore to search for and board foreign shipping and to inspect and collect customs and to prevent smuggling. Later on, they would get involved with the War of 1812. In the meantime, U.S. maritime commerce between the Caribbean and South American countries and the U.S. was expanding. We had large coastal schooners, like the one you see on the screen, the Wyoming, following the shorelines, basically. And the reason they were schooners was the trade winds would go east-west, so therefore you had square riggers crossing the ocean east and west. And when you're following the shore, you'd be tacking all the time with square riggers. It wasn't efficient at all. Schooners were much more efficient for the direction of the wind for coastal piloting. And they were exposed to all kinds of hazards. You've heard stories of all the shipwrecks along the Outer Banks in North Carolina, for example. And even though the skippers were highly proficient in celestial navigation, they mainly followed their experience and coastal piloting. So they were, many were stranded as derelicts and sank or dismasted along treacherous shoals, especially in winter, when the Revenue Cutter Service was kept busy searching for vessels in distress or towing derelicts or blowing them up to prevent them from becoming hazards to navigation. In addition to the offshore patrols, to collect customs and tariff duties, the searches for that. During November each year, all the winter cutters, all the cutters on the Atlantic and in the Gulf were given winter cruising orders. And they were to be fully provisioned and to set sail and not return until spring unless they ran out of provisions or had a number of seizures. And this was really hard on not only the men but also on the ships. And then in 1871, steamships arrived on steam and motor ships, and that moved coastal commerce a little bit further offshore. But they still had the same hazards with storms, but they had the added risk of fire and explosions with mechanical fire-fueled engines. And of course, in 1903, the Wright brothers made their first flight, and Glenn Curtiss emerged as an aviation inventor and instructor, one of the primary supporters of naval aviation. Captain Washington Chambers, he established a Navy interest in aviation, supporting the fleet during that same period, and later, of course, we all know about Mr. Ely making his first shipboard takeoff as a demonstration for the Navy. In 1911, the original Curtiss flight class was held in Coronado, California, and Lieutenant Ellison became the Navy's air pilot #1. They didn't have naval aviator as a term back then. He was an air pilot. And in 1913, Glenn Curtiss opened the Atlantic Coast Aeronautical Station in Hampton Roads to train and license civilian and Navy aviation pilots. In 1913, Stone graduated from the Revenue Cutter School of Instruction. That was the forerunner of the Coast Guard Academy. They had engineering curriculum primarily, as did the Naval Academy. There were no civilian universities or colleges with a higher education in aviation training, engineering training, and in many cases, any engineering training. When Stone graduated, he was assigned to the cutter Onondaga that was moored next to the Atlantic Coast Aeronautical Station, Curtiss's training station. This is before Pensacola. And when the Navy was training its air pilots at Squantum, Massachusetts, at Curtiss's school in Coronado, and at Curtiss's school in Hampton Roads, and also in New York. And as a matter of interest, so as to start the naval engineering curriculum, Lieutenant Hunsaker, a Naval Academy graduate, in 1913 was also ordered by the Navy to MIT to establish a aeronautical engineering curriculum at MIT. Next to the Onondaga's moorings there in Hampton Roads with the Atlantic Coast Aeronautical Station, there was a lot of flying boat activity. And that really piqued the interest of Stone and Hall, two classmates. And that sparked a vision for offshore patrols to lessen the time that it took to cover large areas to search for smugglers or vessels in distress or whatever. And the experiment was so successful that they asked their commanding officer to come with them. And they visited with Curtiss and Baldwin, the flight instructor, head of flight instructor at Curtiss's school. So $1.5 million was appropriated by the Treasury Department to provide training and lease of aircraft to conduct this experiment. While there, Stone had befriended many early aviators who were also trained at the same station. A good example is General William Billy Mitchell. He was too old for the Army to allow him to go to flight training, so he was stationed at the War Department in Washington. He would get in his boat moored over by what is now the National Defense University and motor down to Hampton Roads every weekend on his own dime, paid for his own instruction. And after he was finished his instruction and obtained his license, that's when the Army decided to give him his wings. So that's Billy Mitchell of fame in World War II. He also was a good friend of Victor Carlson and Vernon Castle, who were also there. One interesting point is that when Stone was getting his instruction, Curtis gave him the exact same instruction that Ellison and Softly got in Coronado. No wonder the Navy was really impressed when he went to Pensacola for flight training. Because Curtis also, something that Ellison and Softly did not get, was taken offshore, where he was trained in making offshore landings. Because if you found a smuggling vessel, you had to stop them and maybe use use of force to stop them. And that required landing and keeping them under gun sights until somebody arrived out there to take them on from with a boarding party. So hostilities were erupting in Europe in 1914, and in 1915 the Revenue Cutter Service and the Life Saving Service were merged and formed today's modern Coast Guard. And when the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, the Navy froze all flight orders to commissioned line officers. And this included the Coast Guard officers when the Coast Guard had been moved over to the Navy Department for the war effort. That's why all of the, basically all of the new Navy pilots coming out were enlisted or warrant officer for the Fleet Reserve. And so you had a very limited supply of officer pilots that were line officer pilots that were trained in engineering curriculum. They were all either Naval Academy or Coast Guard Academy graduates. The Navy had only 9 engineering trained line officer aviators, and the Coast Guard had 8. The Coast Guard was transferred to the Navy Department, and Stone, when he graduated from flight training at Pensacola, his first assignment was the USS Huntington. You notice on there the catapult on the stern there, and the early catapults, the Huntington was one of the first ones to be tested in Pensacola Bay, as a matter of fact. It was powered by compressed air from torpedo launch air compressors that were being taken off from cruisers and destroyers. And they did not maintain a constant pressure for the cat shot. So as a result, you had some successful cat shots, but you also had some where the pilots just sort of dribbled over the side, and they weren't happy. And the carriage that cradled the flying boat that was catapulted would be shot over the side on every shot. They lost it. Nothing to stop. They didn't have any way to stop it. After his assignment on the Huntington, he was assigned to the Naval Air Station, Rockaway Beach, where he was to become the seaplane test pilot at Rockaway until the commanding officer arrived and took command. And then these 9 Navy and 8 Coast Guard pilots with engineering experience were assigned to the Bureau of Construction and Repair at the Washington Navy Yard, which was the heart of the beginning of a structured development of naval aviation. This is before BUAREO, or BUAIR, and they were to report to Captain Moffett, an old battleship captain, who was to help the Navy in getting some discipline in the engineering approach for the development and growth of naval aviation. Aircraft trials. These same officer aviators were assigned to conduct aircraft trials or acceptance tests for new aircraft that were being submitted to the Navy for purchase. And an aircraft trial would be called an acceptance flight test in today's terms. And they were very thorough. They started with a complete inspection, weight and balance measurements under differing configurations. For example, whether they were in a bombing configuration or a fighter type configuration. Handling and stability at high speed, cruising speed, low speed, and at various altitudes. Rates of climb, service ceiling, a dive to terminal velocity, spins and recovery, both power on, power off, ordnance delivery, release of bombs and dives at various angles, catapulting and cockpit suitability, and for planes and amphibians, boat hull and water handling characteristics were added. Stone was assigned as a Navy test pilot for 37 of early Navy dirigibles, float planes, and flying boats. And he flew with every single one of the test pilots that were assigned to Moffett. As a result, they all developed a very close bond, and this is kind of an important thing to realize because of the dangerous activity that they were in, and they appreciated each other's professional performance. And they preferred to fly with each other and not with other pilots as a result. That's kind of an interesting, that's the Navy's first dirigible, the DN-1. Stone conducted the first dirigible aircraft trial. It was held at Naval Air Station Montauk Point. It turned out it didn't have enough power and thrust, and it was scrapped. And one other interesting one was Stone gave a down to the Wright brothers. His WS float plane failed the aircraft trial that Stone put it through. And in his formal report, Stone wrote, and I'm going to quote this, "Sufficient tests should be made to demonstrate that these meet contractors' guarantee to fulfill the demonstration requirements," unquote. Pretty harsh words for the first in flight brothers. And at the same time, and this is kind of relevant for the Liberty engine, the Army Signal Corps had established an aviation engineering and manufacturing command at McCook Field in Dayton, Ohio, which later would become Wright-Patt. Here you're looking at the entire inventory of the Army going into World War I before they really started ramping up. Stone was ordered to McCook Field to conduct tests on the new Liberty engine, 400 horsepower compression engine. He made performance comparisons. He reviewed critical parts and strength of materials for the components. By raising the compression ratio on the engine, they were able to increase the horsepower substantially. And as a result, these were the engines that were chosen for the NC aircraft for the first transatlantic flight, and they became the Navy standard engine for most of the early naval aircraft, Navy aircraft. Stone now is a first lieutenant. Now, this isn't the same as with the Marine Corps or the Army grade systems. This really mimics the British Navy as far as their rank structure is concerned. So a first lieutenant now means that he's a senior lieutenant or junior lieutenant commander in Navy terms. And he was ordered to NAS Rockaway again as a test pilot for Seaplane Division 1. That's the NC flying boats for the first transatlantic flight. Towers, familiar name to most of you aviators in the Navy, was also ordered to NAS Rockaway Beach as commander of NC Division 1 for the first transatlantic flight. He divided preparation responsibilities for this flight by placing Lieutenant Stone under Lieutenant Commander Patrick Bellinger for operations, and he assigned Lieutenant Commander A.C. Reed for material and placed Lieutenant J.G. Hinton under Lieutenant Commander Byrd for navigation. Now this is, flight safety officers will perk up on this one. This is a lesson learned. Hasty decisions and hasty work, and this happened over and over again as they were rushing to try to meet the lunar cycle for a moonlit sea for the first transatlantic flight. In a cold, unheated hangar at NAS Rockaway Beach caused the loss of NC-2. So now you understand why we're down to 3 flying boats for the first transatlantic flight when they had started out with 4. It was an early Sunday morning. Machinist mate had interrupted his work to find fuel drums for NC-1 when an electrical pump caught fire and a fuel hose pulled out of a fuel drum caught fire and fuel spewed all over the hangar deck, causing NC-1's starboard wing to be hopelessly burned along the lower elevators and part of the lower stabilizers of NC-4 as well. So a big blow to the effort for the first transatlantic flight. Stone happened to be in the hangar working late at night. He was a particular man for attention to detail, and he was looking to see that everything would be just perfect for his responsibilities for the flight. And so he took charge because he was on scene, and they extinguished the fire before total destruction of NC-1 and NC-4. Ended up cannibalizing what parts were left from NC-2 to replace the burned out parts on NC-1 and NC-4. That was the first time that Stone saved a first transatlantic flight aircraft. Now we get back to the flight test and where the test pilots all preferred to fly with each other. For a pilot to be assigned to the first transatlantic flight, they were required to be one of Moffat's test pilots and to have been assigned to a unit operating in World War I combat zone. Lieutenant Commander Byrd never served on a unit operating in a combat zone. He did not qualify, and that really had a spur in his saddle. He tried everything he could with the Secretary of Navy and politicians and senior command to try to become a part of the transatlantic flight. But it was denied, and therefore A.C. Reed maintained his position as commanding officer of NC-4. As a second place prize, Byrd was given a surrogate to fly in his place. And that's how Hinton became the co-pilot of NC-4. Hinton had never been a test pilot, but he had been a quartermaster on an armored cruiser that bird was on. Now, at this time, when Hinton graduated from flight training, he was a Lieutenant JG, and Stone was a full lieutenant, so Stone was senior to him as well. As well as Stone had been a test pilot, and also on the Huntington had been in a combat war zone on convoy duty to England. This is the assignments for NC3, where you have Towers as the division commander, and Holden was the pilot, McCulloch. Here's NC4, AC Reed as the commanding officer and navigator. Trepassey, Newfoundland was picked as the departure point because it was the closest Great Circle route to Europe. It would be from Trepassey to Lisbon, Portugal, by way of the Azores. And they were departing NAS Rockaway Beach when NC4 had to shut down its after center tandem engine due to an oil leak. And water spewed out from the forward tandem engine while en route. They had to shut it down. So here they are, 80 miles offshore with 2 engines down and 2 engines left. Stone landed the NC4 in the open seas, 80 miles offshore from Naval Air Station Chatham, Massachusetts. They taxied all night on the water to Chatham, where their one engine was repaired and the other was swapped out. And that was the second time that Stone had saved one of the NC aircraft. And then we had, on the flight itself, there's a navigation lesson here to be learned, and here's another flight safety officer's point to note down. They followed a line of destroyer picket ships as their primary aid to navigation. Lieutenant Commander Byrd had developed a bubble sextant, and the Naval Observatory had developed what ultimately would become the Air Almanac, tables for the navigators to use with a regular sextant, or the bubble sextant that Byrd had invented, and that's how they got celestial shots. AC Reed was a very meticulous officer, and he made a very meticulous navigational plot all the way across. He updated every 15 minutes to a half hour a fix for their position for going across. The other two weren't anywhere near as careful, because about halfway across they entered what we would call IFR type conditions, and those were not IFR type aircraft. There was no gyro stabilized instrumentation on there. Their compass was just a boat compass on gimbals that could bounce off the gimbals at any point in time. And so they were relying on DRs. And AC Reed had fixes and had determined wind direction and velocity with each fix. So when they lost sight of the horizon and the stars and such due to IFR type conditions, when he did a DR somewhere, he did a DR from a DR, not from an estimated position or from another DR. Now you can understand why NC1 and NC3 were so far off track. Now the other thing was that most of you all have heard ignition noise on your radios from your car when the spark plugs were interfering with the radio. Well, they didn't have ignition suppression back then. They had the NC4's radio officer, when he had the brand new HF radios and direction finder. The NC-4's radio officer mounted his antenna on the outboard wingtip, away from any engine noise. The other two radio officers, and for NC-1 and NC-3, mounted their antennas directly underneath the center tandem tractor and pusher engines. And the interference from the ignition noise of those two engines made those things just totally worthless for radio transmission, as well as receiving any direction finder cuts for updating the navigational plot. So now here they had relied on DRs, and they're way off course, and they're unable to see any stars or anything for celestial navigation, and they can't even get a cut on the mothership's radio transmissions to them over at Horta in the Azores to find a bearing to be able to get over to Horta to refuel. So they were desperate, and they were running low on fuel. Their only choice was to land and shut down the engines and get a direction finder line of position so they could continue on to get to Horta. Well, their landings were surprises to them. They didn't realize until they were rounding out for a touchdown just how big the seas were. They were very large seas, and as a result, they received, both aircraft received such damage that they were unable to take off again. One was lost, and the other, due to expert seamanship, was sailed into Horta later, but was unusable for the rest of the flight. A.C. Reed's navigation strength is what pulled the NC-4 into a successful flight into Horta to refuel and then continue on to Lisbon for a successful transatlantic flight. Stone had made every single one of the takeoffs and landings up to that point, and Hinton was getting a little testy because he wanted to have a chance for making a takeoff. So he talked his CO, A.C. Reed, into letting him take off from Lisbon for the next part of the flight up to Portsmouth, England, for celebrations for the arrival on the first transatlantic flight. One thing that I neglected to cover also, when they were about halfway across and they found themselves in these quasi-IFR type conditions, Hinton was at the controls, and you got to realize, any of you all that have flown in rough weather, you know that the angle of attack over the airfoil, it changes when you're bouncing around in rough weather. And you're kind of dependent upon the distance between the center of gravity and the angle of attack. Well, it was so short on the NC, on all those early aircraft, but particularly the NC aircraft, that there was only 8 knots difference between stall speed and cruise speed. How'd you like to head into rough air with something like that? And Hinton found himself in a stall and a flat spin, just like that, when rough air hit him. And Stone grabbed the controls, and using just a faint sun to help him for orientation, recovered after falling from 15,000 feet to about 1,200 feet off the surface for them to continue the flight. They were VFR beneath the fog layer at that point, with the mothership in Horta reporting that it was VFR below the clouds all the way to Horta. And that's how they continued. And that was the 3rd time that Stone saved an NC aircraft. You've seen these medals over in the museum itself, so I'm not going to... this is the Order of the Tower and Sword that all the crews got. However, Stone did receive the RAF Cross, and he was one of the very first ones to receive that. And the French president presented a solid silver memorabilia to each of the NC-4 crew. And after the flight was completed, Stone was returned to the Treasury Department. Back then they were under the Treasury Department, like we're under Homeland now. After the war. There we go. And our first air station you heard earlier today about Morehead City, it was a naval air station that was surplused, and the Coast Guard used that for its first air station, and there was HS-2L aircraft that the Navy had as surplus, and those were the first Coast Guard aircraft. And unfortunately, Congress did not provide funding, and after a year they had to close it, and that was the end of Coast Guard aviation for a while. In November, Admiral Moffett requests Stone's return to the Navy. And for a test pilot for the catapult shots on off the Jupiter for the development of the first 3 aircraft carriers, in particular the Langley. Earlier, after the Huntington, Stone had developed and invented the powder catapult. But the powder catapult used 3-inch and 5-inch naval cartridges as its propelling device for the catapult. So it maintained consistent pressure. And then he had a hydraulic brake that he designed so that the carriage wouldn't go over the side. So those 2 problems were solved, and you had a successful cat shot just about every single time with that, and the Navy was really pleased with that. And we've heard about the Rum War earlier. Stone was, along with the rest of the NC-4 crews, was presented the Navy Cross. And Bu Aereo was established in 1921. And that basically brought the old Bureau of Construction and Repair at the Navy Yard and the Bureau of Steam Engineering Testing Division together and linked them and became Bu Air. And Admiral Moffett, because he was an old battleship guy, was required by Congress, if he was going to be the head of this new technical bureau in the Navy, had to earn some wings, had to earn his wings. So he became the Navy's first naval observer to answer that requirement. He was very successful. And when he was relieved from Bu Air, he was appointed technical advisor to an international conference, the Washington Naval Conference, that determined what countries could have in the way of naval units. The Navy, the U.S., was 2 heavy cruisers over its allotted number. The battle cruiser Saratoga and the battle cruiser Lexington were on the ways and getting ready to be launched. And Moffett came up with a unique idea. The rest of the world did not understand the power of a fast aircraft carrier at the time. But England and Japan did. But he convinced the rest of the world that the Navy would reluctantly give up these 2 battle cruiser hulls and instead launch them as fast attack aircraft carriers. They were very useful for us during World War II, and Moffett chuckled at the results of putting that one over. This is the powder catapult that I told you about, and this is the tests of this powder catapult from the first large Atlantic Fleet exercise. And here's the first one being launched. They put them on top of the turrets, this platform. They launched them off from the turrets. And this was later designed into a turntable powder catapult. And you probably saw some of these on the fantails of many of the old battleships and cruisers. This is one being tested at the Navy factory in Philadelphia. This was the first cat for the Langley. And until the Hermes came along, the British Hermes came along with the steam catapult, the powder catapult was the standard for aircraft carriers for the Navy. As a result, Stone under Bew Aerial was assigned as the lead for development of the Langley catapults and for aircraft arresting gear, because the Langley was going to be the test bed for the Saratoga and the Lexington. The Coast Guard Commandant at that time wanted Stone back. At this point, he was a lieutenant commander, because for the rum war, they were short of line officers for commanding officers of these new destroyers you heard about earlier that the Coast Guard had acquired for fighting the rum war. However, the Navy sent emissaries over to the Commandant, Captain Whiting and a couple others, and they convinced the Commandant that he really was essential that Stone maintain his position, particularly for the development of the arresting gear for the Lexington and Saratoga. Because the arresting gear for the Langley originally was pretty primitive. It was a bunch of boilerplates tied together with a manila line on each side and sandbags that the hook would catch, and they'd drag these plates. Then they had to realign all the plates on the side each time they wanted to retrieve another aircraft. So having an actual arresting gear, sort of like the ones we have on modern carriers today, the only difference really being a little more primitive design for the hydraulic components of the arresting gear, and they used manila line instead of steel cable. His final assignment with the Navy was overseeing the installation of the aviation suite on the Lexington and Saratoga. The NC-4 crews were later given the Congressional Gold Medal for the first transatlantic flight on May 23rd, 1930, with President Hoover presiding. And so now he's back with the Coast Guard, and he's assigned as a senior member for the trial board for the acceptance of the new Coast Guard Fokker PJ flying boat, which was thought of by many of the Coast Guard aviators of the time to be the best seaplane for offshore landings. It was known as the flying ambulance. A significant event occurred when the USS Akron, the Navy's dirigible, crashed off Barnegat Inlet in a fierce winter storm. Well, actually, it was in the spring. And Stone had flown in his RD-4 from his position as commanding officer in Cape May, New Jersey, to Coast Guard headquarters, landing at NAS Anacostia for a conference with commanding officers. When he heard that the Akron had crashed, and his friend Moffett and others from the old Bew Air days were on board and were in peril. So he took off from Anacostia, went back, refueled, and headed out into the same winter storm that was preventing other rescue vessels from reaching the Akron, and made an open sea landing in those heavy seas and recovered the Akron's executive officer, Commander Kermine, and one crew member who was not able to find Admiral Moffett or the rest. He flew back to Anacostia, delivering the bodies to the Navy. And a Washington Times reporter asked him, why did you take such a risk for a flight like that? And his answer was, it was the least I could do. Then he was assigned as Inspector of Naval Aircraft for both the Navy and the Coast Guard for acceptance at the Douglas Aircraft Company in Santa Monica for the Grumman Duck, the JF-2. as well as the new Secretary of Treasurer's airplane. That's kind of an ancient airplane, isn't it? So he was the one that made the acceptance tests for the duck that both the Navy and the Coast Guard used throughout World War II. And he established a speed record modifying the duck engine-wise and cowling-wise to establish the world speed record. While observing tests at his new command at the Coast Guard Air Station in San Diego, he was stricken with a coronary thrombosis and abruptly died. But some of his legacies are the Spencer-class, Secretary-class cutter that you heard about earlier. It was originally built with a boom. It carried 2 Grumman ducks and operated with the ducks just like your battleships and cruisers would operate ducks for scout aircraft. So this chronology shows a very strong testimony to Elmer Stone in many talents, his contributions to both Coast Guard and Naval Aviation. And at the time of his death, however, he was revered by the Naval Aviation community, and unfortunately within the Coast Guard, he did not receive his deserved recognition and support of everyone until after his death, long after his death. As a matter of fact, A.C. Reed and Bellinger were supposed to be pallbearers for his interment in Arlington, and they were abruptly canceled off from it as an example of the type of spitefulness that was going on with some jealous officers. Well, that concludes my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.